Hello, and welcome to my podcast about women's sports, in which I will be focusing on the inequality in media coverage of professional sports. I'm your host, Morelia Rosas Martinez, and today I'll be discussing media coverage of women's sports. Specifically, I'll be talking about why women should receive equal media coverage in both quality and quantity as men in sports, in professional sports, because it not only provides equal opportunity for recognition, but it also impacts attitudes towards women's sports positively. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about why I chose this topic, why I chose to focus on sports media coverage, and that's because I'm a big sports fan, and I have been for a long time. I myself like to play a lot of sports. I used to play basketball in middle school, and I ran cross country and track all throughout high school, and I just love the community of like sports and athletics and, just athletes. And watching sports is also something that's just super inspiring to me. So I think that's one of the reasons why I spend so much time following professional sports. And I like to follow all sorts of teams, athletes, and just any types of sports because that's just something I like to do. I find it fun and interesting. And I grew up watching sports at home all my childhood, mostly soccer though, because my family has always been very big soccer fans. And whenever the Mexican national team, I should say though, the men's Mexican national team played, we were all glued to the TV. And in all the time I spent watching sports as a child though, I did not see very many women athletes. It was almost always men. The rare times that I heard women athletes being talked about or even heard about women's sports was every 4 years, which was during the Olympics, which is really sad because that's only once every 4 years, and that is not nearly enough recognition and praise that female athletes should be getting. And I didn't even know that there was that women had a soccer FIFA World Cup as well. I didn't know until 2015 when I saw my aunt watching it, which was kind of a surprising moment to me because we grew up waiting every 4 years for the men's FIFA World Cup, and we would follow Mexico's journey and cheer them on every game and watch the finals and semifinals, quarterfinals, all those very very exciting games in the World Cup. But I never once heard the women's FIFA World Cup being mentioned, or I almost wonder if my family didn't even know it existed either. But yeah, it wasn't until I saw my aunt watching it in 2015 that I realized that women also have a World Cup. And so ever since then, I've followed that. I followed soccer, women's soccer, and their big games as well. And so, yeah, ever since I began following sports, I've noticed the lack of women's sports coverage and the way that men's sports are the unmarked category. And so to be in the unmarked category means to be in the category that feels normal and doesn't require any additional explanation. For example, the men's basketball league in the U.S. is the NBA, which stands for the National Basketball Association, whereas the women's league is called the WNBA, which is the Women's National Basketball Association. For the soccer leagues, it's MLS for men, which stands for the Major League Soccer, and for women, it's the NWSL, which is the National Women's Soccer League. Even in podcasts or other forms of media, you see them describe their material and their content as focused on sports, but really they mean men's sports, because if you dig a little deeper into what they actually cover, you never actually see women's sports being mentioned or female athletes or anything like that. So really they mean men's sports, but they just say they focus on sports. So, women in sports is the marked category because it's something that in society is seen as something that requires additional explanation because it doesn't feel normal. So, to help explain how women have always been the marked category and how women in sports was never seen as normal or natural, let's look a little into the history of sports and more specifically, I guess, women's sports. Let's begin by saying that women weren't allowed to participate in sports for a long time and therefore barely got coverage when sports began to get the media's attention. And this is because women were seen as weak. Society said it was not natural for a woman to be an athlete because that would mean being strong, and those are things that are associated with being masculine. Society had certain gender norms in which the gender difference between a man and a woman was that men perform better in sports, and therefore men are the only ones that are meant to participate in sports. When women did begin to play sports, or at least when it was starting to be recorded, some of the most popular sports were horseback riding, archery, golf, tennis, skiing, and skating. And those were most enjoyed amongst women in the upper social class. And when women began to participate more in sports, they were finally allowed in the modern Olympic Games in 1900. However, only 22 out of the 997 athletes that competed were women, and they only participated in 5 different sports, which were tennis, sailing, croquet, equestrianism, and golf. These were all popular amongst women of upper social class, yet again. So these 22 women were also all white women. It's important to acknowledge that because black women weren't allowed to participate until the 1936 Berlin Olympics. For example, Louis Stokes and Tiddy Pickett, 2 black female American track and field athletes, both qualified for the Olympics in 1932, but were not allowed to participate because of their race. So instead, they went on to participate in the 1936 Olympics. This right here is a reflection of intersectionality. As Kimberly Crenshaw states, intersectionality is the idea that we experience life based on a number of identities we have. White women of upper social class, in this case, were allowed to participate in 1900, but black women weren't allowed. Another example of this is seen in how often black women are banned and just banned from championships or other competitions in specific events because their testosterone levels were too high or they just aren't seen as female. An example of this is Olympic champion Caster Semenya. Caster Semenya is a South African middle distance runner and winner of 2 Olympic gold medals and 3 world championships in the women's 800 meters. She is an intersex woman who was assigned female at birth, but has naturally elevated testosterone levels, and so she's ran into a lot of issues with officials and things like bans. So in 2019, new world athletics rules came into force, preventing women like Semenya from participating in the 400 meters, 800 meters, and 1500 meter events in the female classification unless they take medication to suppress their testosterone levels. And in 2021, she filed an appeal with the European Court of Human Rights against the restrictions. This is also seen in just how athletes are tested to see if they really are women and can compete in the female events. So, as stated by Fausto-Sterling in Dualisms, female Olympic athletes were often asked to parade naked in front of board examiners. And all they needed to prove that one was a woman were breasts and a vagina, which meant the Olympics were not only degrading women, but they were excluding anyone that didn't fit into the social construct of male or female. So what do I mean by the social construct of male and female? So I mean that, as Fausto-Sterling states in Dualisms, labeling someone a man or a woman is a social decision, and this is because our beliefs of what is to be a man or a woman defines the labels we make. So now an important question to ask is, why do they exclude those who don't fit into the gender binary? And I think this is because they want to maintain the gender divisions because intersexuals embody both sexes, and so therefore they weaken claims about sexual differences. It's also important to note that the decision of whether women could participate in the event or not was up to men who operated the Olympic Games, and the way they chose it was based on whether the sport was feminine. And they weren't allowed to participate in certain sports due to the social construction of sex and gender norms, and so women were often hated for participating in sports as it was seen as not being feminine, and so that's why they chose the sports they could participate in, and that was only those sports seen as feminine. It's also important to note that although the IOC didn't require modern chromosome screening in the interest of international politics until 1968, it had long policed the sex of Olympic competitors in an effort to mollify those who feared that women's participation in sports threatened to turn them into manly creatures. In 1912, Pierre de Coubertin, founder of the modern Olympics, argued that women's sports are all against the law of nature. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of sports media coverage. People have been participating in sports since the beginning of time, but sports media coverage didn't start until the early 19th century with sports journalism in newspapers and magazines. Its popularity led to the growth of sports coverage, and in the 20th century, magazines and TV channels that focused on sports were first published, such as Sports Illustrated and ESPN. Voice and live broadcasting of sports also began in the 20th century, with the first voice broadcasting taking place in April 11, 1911, from a live radio station located in Pittsburgh, and the first live broadcast in the U.S. was on May 17, 1939, which was a college baseball game between the Columbia Lions and the Princeton Tigers, and this was broadcast by NBC. However, the world's first televised sporting event, so not just the U.S., the world's first, was the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And with technology advancements now, most of the media coverage is now digital and on social media. Specifically, Twitter has become an outlet for sports media, and it's huge in that. I know I follow many sports teams on Twitter and get a lot of my sports news on Twitter as well. However, it is important to know it did take a much longer time to find Twitter accounts that focus on women's sports, and that's something that certainly reflects this lack of media coverage in women's sports. So moving into kind of how sports media coverage is now, the quantity of sports media coverage has changed, and so did the quality of it, but that's in terms of men's sports. When sports media coverage began, it was only male sports that were being covered, and it was not a lot, but the type of things that were being covered, it was kind of like they did play-by-play coverage, which is a detailed description and analysis of the event, and also game recaps. And now they start to do a lot more. They do a lot more statistical analysis, and they also follow the athletes and talk a little more about their backgrounds in the media as well. However, again, important to note, this was all men's. This is kind of the change that was being made in men's sports, because there is not a lot of change that has been made in women's sports. So, according to a study led by Purdue University professor Cheryl Cookie, in 2019, coverage of women's athletes on televised news and highlight shows, including ESPN's SportsCenter, totaled only 5.4% of all airtime, which is a negligible change from the 5% observed in 1989 and 5.1% in 1993. Women make up 40% of all participants in sports, yet somehow they're receiving only about 5% of sports media coverage. And so in all the years that I've been following women's sports now, I see that there's very little media coverage. It's really bad, and not only do they have very little amount of media coverage, but the quality is just not as good as men's sports get. I watch men's sports, for example, and the commentators are very enthusiastic. They know the athletes. They have the information on them. There's the statistics on their game, on their performance. But when watching women's sports, they almost seem uninterested in the athlete, as an athlete at least, and spend too much time talking about unrelated things such as their body or their home life, their personal lives, their age, and things like that. The University of Cambridge researched the use of language to refer to women and men in sport through multi-billion world databases of written and spoken English from a vast range of media sources, and men tend to be mentioned almost 3 times more often than women in relation to sport. And the same online articles highlight that in the comparison with men, women are disproportionately referred to regarding their appearance, clothes, and personal lives, and that women's aesthetics are largely emphasized over their athletic performance. The most common words associated or combined for women in sport are aged, older, pregnant, and married or unmarried. Conversely, the words most chosen to describe men in sport are fastest, strong, big, real, and great. So basically, they spend their time objectifying women and speaking about everything but their athletic performance. And this is because who's the people who are talking here are men. Men make up most of the sports commentators and sports journalists by far, and this is all they're speaking in terms of the male gaze. So, what is the male gaze? The male gaze is the act of depicting women in the world from a masculine, heterosexual perspective that presents and represents women as sexual objects for the pleasure of the heterosexual male viewer. So, in this case, they objectify women a lot because that's the way that they see women. They see them as objects and sexual pleasures. And so, really, women are treated by media outlets and people on the internet constantly as just eye candy. They are also often depicted in a sexualized manner in sports magazine covers, wearing outfits that are very revealing and have nothing to do with their sport. They're always smiling, or they're making a very serious face with the label of hot in the cover. And they're just always sexualized. An example of how women are treated and portrayed in the world of sports and the media comes from 2015, after 7th-ranked Canadian tennis star Eugenie Bouchard won her match in the Australian Open to advance to the 3rd round. And an Australian commentator comes up to her after the match, and asks her to twirl to show off her hot pink outfit. So he asks something completely unrelated to the match. He doesn't ask her about the match or how she was feeling after the match, etc. He just asked for her to twirl and show off her outfit.
Can you give us a twirl and tell us about your outfit?
A twirl?
A twirl, a pirouette. Here we go.
So yeah, that was the moment when he asked her to twirl. And it's funny, actually, she kind of responded a little bit like excited or happy that he was asking that, and, gave the twirl, but it just seems like a completely unrelated and inappropriate question to ask. Women are also often ignored when it comes to talking about athletic performance or athletic accomplishments. An example of this is seen in a video back from 2017 after a Wimbledon match, when a journalist had to be corrected in saying that Sam Querrey, a American tennis player, was the first U.S. player to reach a major semifinal since 2009, failing to recognize and acknowledge that the Williams sisters had already previously done this. In fact, since 2009, Serena Williams had won between that time 12 Grand Slam tournaments.
The first U.S. player to reach a major semifinal since 2009. How would you describe
male player?
I beg your pardon?
Male player, right?
Yes, first male player.
So that was the moment when the journalist had to be corrected by Andy Murray after saying that Sam Querrey was the first U.S. player to reach a major semifinal since 2009. In this case, saying the first U.S. player means the first male U.S. player, but by saying the first U.S. player, he is making that he's making male U.S. player the unmarked category, whereas he would have had to say female U.S. player to mean female. So now I'm going to move in a little bit to showing how this provides equal opportunities for recognition for women. An increase in and improvements in quantity and quality of women's sports coverage will get more people to engage with women's sports. Therefore, more people will support women and female athletes and give them the recognition they deserve. Making women's sports easier to access means more people will watch, and an increased media coverage provides opportunities for more fans and more interest in women's sports. An increased fan base will lead to more companies reaching out to female athletes for marketing ads, and more, just in general, more opportunities for women to be recognized and female athletes to be getting the recognition they deserve. People often argue that women don't need equal media coverage because they are not well known, or they don't deserve it because they don't have enough fans and they won't get any viewers, listeners, readers, etc. So basically, they believe that ratings will go down and they'll lose a lot of money, so women just don't deserve the equal media coverage. However, there are a lot of people that want to watch, and there are a lot of examples in which sports fans say they are interested. Look, for example, at the 2019 FIFA Women's World Cup. According to Forbes, FIFA announced that a combined 1.12 billion viewers tuned into the official broadcast coverage of the 2019 Women's World Cup held in France, and the final match between the US and the Netherlands drew an average live audience of 82.18 million and reached a total of 263.62 million unique viewers. So clearly there are people interested in watching female athletes compete, and while many people will continue to argue that the reason they don't get media coverage is that they don't bring in any money, then what about those 263.62 million viewers? Those are a lot of people, and there's constant increase in demand of women's sports. And only 4% of the total commercial investment, according to athletesassessments.com, goes into women's sports, but a 2019 Nielsen report reveals that 84% of general sports fans have an interest in women's sports. And in order for women's sports to grow, they need to give them the opportunity to showcase their talent and work. There really is no way for them to grow if there is no support, because the media won't show it. In getting better media coverage as well, women, like I said, will be recognized by more companies. They'll be used in more marketing ads and getting that recognition. And that can also lead to equal pay, which is a huge issue as well in the world of sports, as there is a great inequality in the pay of women's sports versus men's sports. So now I'm going to talk about the positive impacts that greater quality and quantity of media coverage would have on attitudes towards women's sports. With better quality of women's sports coverage, more people will engage with women's sports positively, as they will start to realize their prejudice. Current comments on women's bodies and other features takes the focus away from their athletic performance. For most women watching, that will be disrespectful, and they won't want to watch if women are constantly being objectified and sexualized. And for men, it'll probably encourage them to continue making comments on women's bodies rather than their athletic performance, because that is another big issue. Is there's constant comments, tons and tons of comments on social media made on female athletes' bodies and appearance and other things like that, rather than their athletic performance. The current quality of media coverage continues to encourage gender stereotypes, as they are portraying women as sexual pleasures and keeping a focus on family, whereas they're portraying men as strong and powerful people. Basically, women are valued as women in the view of society, but not athletes. This is harmful and doesn't help the way people see women's sports at all. By constantly focusing on the appearance, family, or age of female athletes instead of their athletic abilities and performance, they continue to tell the public to view women this way. It tells the public that women are to be recognized for those features, but not as athletes. To have positive impacts, this means focusing on the statistics of their game and commenting on athletic performance and not body and attitude and age and any other form of appearance. It's important to acknowledge once again that intersectionality is always at play, and therefore, while all women athletes get bad quality of media coverage depending on race or other identifying factors, they may get called out on specific things due to stereotypes. For example, many women athletes experience having their age and bodies talked about in the media, but Black women are often the ones that also get their behavior questioned. For example, Serena Williams, an American professional tennis player, was called crazy at the end of her semifinal loss at the 2009 U.S. Open because she called out the line umpire who made a bad call against her, which was something that happened to her often, actually. Then, in the 2012 Olympics, she was criticized for her celebration dance at the end of her win in the women's singles final, which meant her first singles gold medal. The reporter said, quote, "What Serena did was akin to cracking a tasteless X-rated joke inside a church, and Serena deserved to be called out. What she did was immature and classless." This is something that's been happening for a long time. Since the 1930s, sports commentators have described Black women in racist terms, referring to them as dancing monkeys, for example. These comments on their behavior enforce the stereotype of angry Black women and seeing women as masculine or animal-like creatures. Normal comments focus on athletic ability and less comments on body and appearance and behavior and age means less people making comments on these features of women and more comments on their actual athletic performance. There is also a constant comparison of women to men athletes, often when being talked about and when people make claims as to why women's sports don't deserve the media coverage, the equal media coverage. People argue that this is because women are just not as good as men. They never will be. They can't perform as good in sports. But I think we need to focus on the importance of women's sports and change that attitude of comparison because it doesn't help at all. And it continues to hurt women's sports by constantly comparing it to men's sports. The few times that women's sports are covered on sports media outlets, the comments are filled with hate. Sports fans constantly commenting on women's appearance, comparing them to men, their age, or their behavior, and the media outlets give no reaction to this. Rather, they continue to post men's sports coverage and only post once every couple of months about women's sports. And this just continues to encourage hate towards women's sports, and it's not helping at all. Media outlets need to do a better job at discouraging hate towards women's sports and calling out those people who constantly hate on women, female athletes, and instead start to post more content about women in sports. Not only does it engage more people with women's sports and therefore make them realize their prejudice and start seeing women's sports in a more positive way, but it also inspires younger girls as they see people like them on screen, running, playing sports such as basketball, soccer, golf, tennis, anything, which is why it's also important that all women's sports get equal media coverage. Sports filled with more Black women or women of color need to get equal media coverage too. And sports that are more masculine, that are seen as more masculine, such as basketball and soccer, need to get equal media coverage as sports that are seen as more feminine, such as gymnastics and figure skating. Now I want to talk a little bit about ways that this change can be made. because it is important to acknowledge that change needs to be made and improvements need to be seen, but we also need to talk a little bit about ways this can be done. So, one of the biggest things I say can be done is hiring more women journalists and getting more women to be in the sports journalism field. Currently, according to globalsportsmatters.com, only 10% of sports editors and 11.5% of sports reporters are women. So this is troubling because women make up half of the population of the world. Women make up about 40% of athletes, and yet only about 11% of these sports journalists are women. And not even like all of these women cover women's sports. So to think that a lot of men are covering women's sports just further gets at that male gaze, which is why I think there's such a big issue with the quality of women's sports media coverage, is because they're constantly seeing things in this male gaze, and that's how they are talking about women in sports. So it's important for more women journalists to be a part of this so that there is less discrimination, there's less sexualization of women in sports, and more enjoyment on their athletic performance, and more talk on their athletic abilities as well. A big reason why there is such a low number of women in sports is because of the discrimination that women journalists face in a male-dominated field. Female reporters are often laughed at by both their coworkers and male athletes that claim they know nothing about sports and can't know anything about sports because they are females. An example of this is seen in 2017 when a female reporter asked Cam Newton, an NFL player, a question about the game, and he responded by laughing in her face and saying that he finds it funny to hear a female talk about this stuff.
You take a lot of pride in seeing your receivers play well. Devin Funchess has seemed to really embrace the physicality of his routes and getting those extra yards. Does that give you a little bit of an enjoyment to see him kind of truck sticking people out there?
It's funny to hear a female talk about routes. It's funny.
So his response was to say that it's funny to hear a female talk about routes and football in general. Things like this are what get women to not be in these fields. This constant discrimination towards women in fields like these is what prevents them from being in this field. But it is very important that this is stopped, that discrimination in these fields is stopped, because we need more women in these fields in order to improve the quality and quantity of female sports coverage. Another way this can be done is by having men athletes or promote women's sports. Really, everyone promoting women's sports, watching women's sports is a great improvement and will make great change, because the more people watch and support women's sports, the more will encourage the media to improve the quality and quantity of women's sports as well. And so having male athletes with such a big following promote women sports and talk about their enjoyment of women's sports and support women in sports will definitely make great change. And lastly, it's very important that we spend less time debating whether or not women deserve equal media coverage and more time learning about women's sports and investing time into them. Because it shouldn't even be a debate that women deserve equal media coverage, because they are doing just as much and working just as hard as men, as male athletes, but are getting not nearly enough recognition for it. And spending more time learning about women's sports and investing the time into them will definitely change people's attitudes towards it and make people just more knowledgeable on women's sports, which is very important especially going into watching women's sports, because a lot of people, again, compare women's sports to men's sports, but need to acknowledge that they are separate, and women's sports can be just as interesting as men's. So, all of this to say that media coverage is crucial to the development of women's sports, and we should be able to be in a world where they are sharing equal media coverage. Thank you so much for listening to this episode on women's sports and media coverage. I hope this led you to think about watching and supporting women's sports. I hope it encouraged you to support women in sports and watch them and follow their social media pages and follow media outlets that focus on women's sports. And of course, media coverage isn't the only thing that needs to change for equality in sports, but it would be a big step towards equality. Equal media coverage and representation means treating women with the same respect as male athletes. It doesn't necessarily mean to push others down. By raising media coverage of women's sports, we are not looking to talk down on men's sports or put down male athletes. It's about raising the conversation on women's sports. And I hope you took a lot of information and knowledge out of this podcast, and it helped you learn about the inequality in sports and specifically in sports media coverage. Thank you for listening to this episode on women's sports and media coverage. I hope it encouraged you to watch and support women's sports and to encourage the media to cover it. Thanks again for listening, and go watch some women's sports.